welcome to today's webcast on designing Trustworthy AI, the user experience framework. My name is Shane McGraw, and I'll be your moderator for today's talk, and we want the discussion to be as interactive as possible. So feel free to post questions or comments to our chat, the comment section, and we will address as many as we can. Now let me introduce our speaker for today, Carol Smith. Carol is a senior research scientist in the Human-Machine Interaction team at the HCII's Emerging Technology Center here at Carnegie Mellon University, and she's also an adjunct instructor for CMU's HCII program. Now I'd like to turn it over to Carol Smith. Carol, all yours.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about designing trustworthy AI, and I'm going to be presenting a framework that I've been developing. And I definitely look forward to all of your questions. So please bring those into the chat. So AI has a great promise. It's the promise that it will enrich us with knowledge, that it's going to really augment our effectiveness, make us more powerful, more productive, better humans, ideally. But in order to do that, we can and we must ensure that we're keeping humans safe and in control. And a lot of the problems that are arising now are because of a lack of trust in the AI, because there have been bad instances. There have been people doing inadequate and abusive work. And some examples of that briefly are assuming that math reduces bias. So taking a use case, such as in this case, a recruiting tool, and using old data, so previous resumes and previous performance, and using that information to then try to vet applicants. Unfortunately, in this particular situation, the resumes that were reviewed were primarily male. They were primarily from particular universities, that sort of thing. That there was a particular focus on those resumes that created a bias against women. The AI system was trained using those resumes. It actually started to bias against women. It started to show sexism in that whenever a resume was presented that had a women's college on it or women's soccer team or something like that, it was downlinked. And so, unfortunately, in this situation, math did not reduce the bias. Math was not enough to compensate for the bias that was already in the system, that was already in those resumes. Similarly, with mortgage algorithms, there have been a lot of instances of people trying to use AI systems to determine mortgage rates, which seems reasonable. Let's figure out better interest rates for people. Unfortunately, there is a lot of racism in lending over the decades that we have data for. And when that data was used to try to determine future rates, it also was racist. It used those same methods, those same metrics to determine people's interest rates and continued to bias against people who had identified as Black, identified as Latino, or lived in certain neighborhoods. The data was biased against those individuals and continued those existing bad behaviors. They just got embedded into these systems, and so this is very common. One more example is in instances where people in the judicial systems are trying to predict bad behavior and trying to determine who might continue to be a criminal, who might be in a situation where they will create more crime in the future. And unfortunately, because of, again, racism, there are a lot more cases of African Americans and people with darker skin tending to be prosecuted more severely and prosecuted more frequently. And by taking out the humanity, by instead of looking at each individual as they are and their circumstances and the situations that they're in, by dehumanizing and just looking at the numbers, we end up with a racist algorithm again. And this is creating situations where people who are already being biased against are further biased and further facing more difficult situations. So we have to be careful how we use these systems. They only learn what we tell them. And a simpler example is if you were to teach a AI system with a training set about vehicles, and the training set had red cars, green cars, and white cars, and that's what you trained it as. But in the situation you applied it to, there were blue cars. It's possible that the system would be overfit. It would only understand red, green, and white vehicles, and when encountering those blue vehicles would not know how to categorize them, wouldn't necessarily understand them. And so you do have to be very careful about the type of information you give these systems and what you expect from them, because they will make inferences based on what they're given, and take that information and carry it forward. So if it's already biased data, if it's already specific data, when you give it a new situation, it's going to use what it knows to apply to that. So how can development teams create systems that are safe and trustworthy? What can people do? What can you do in your situation to make better systems? So that's what I'm going to be talking about a lot today. I'm going to do a brief introduction of ethics and bias. I'm going to talk about the team qualities that can help you get to success, and introduce that user experience framework and a checklist that we have on the HCII site as well that can support your work that's still being developed. As everything is in AI, we have a lot more work to do. So, technology ethics. Ethics, I hope you are familiar with. They're based on well-found standards of right and wrong. These are the standards of expected behavior that guide our correct course of action. So the way to think about it is, thinking forward, what impact is my work going to have? What am I going to be doing? What choices am I making today that will affect individuals in the future? And so you may be familiar with the trolley problem. And the trolley problem is a thought problem that people use in philosophy classes. And the idea there is that you are thinking through a hypothetical situation, and what would you do in that situation? So for the trolley problem, you're driving a trolley, and the trolley comes to a fork, and if you go to the right, something bad will happen, and if you go to the left, something bad will happen, and you have to choose based on the constraints that you're given which bad thing should happen. So should you injure 3 people or 5 people? Should you injure an individual who has a degree or an individual without a degree, and that sort of thing? It's an activity for a classroom. It is not an activity for artificial intelligence. And the reason why is because at that point, once the vehicle is in motion, once your AI system is out in the open, it's too late for those kinds of decisions to be made. You have to do this work much earlier. This work has to be done at a much earlier point. If you're curious to learn more about the MIT Moral Machine Project, is one you can look at, and there are lots of articles online to learn more about that. But this is really early purposeful work, way before you're in the field, way before your AI system is released. We need to think not just about the code, although that's very important, thinking about the algorithms that you're choosing, but we need to think about the conduct, about the interactions, about the intents. We have to start with some technology ethics. And these are probably separate from regular everyday ethics. So these aren't the ethics with how you interact with humans every day, although they may apply, but rather ethics that are very close to the technology and how the technology is going to be implemented. The benefits of having technology ethics are that you are going to harmonize cultural variations. So ideally, you've got a pretty diverse team. People come from different backgrounds, different experiences. How can we bring them all together to agree on something? And the technology ethics can bring people together. It helps to balance the pace of change. There's a lot of pressure to develop very quickly. And if you have to go through the process of having conversations and thinking through problems, it's naturally going to slow things down and create a comfortable level of discussion. And there's important things that need to happen when you're making systems that are going to influence people's lives. And it gives people permission to consider and question the breadth of those implications. And so by giving people explicit permission, they are much more likely to think more clearly about what they're doing and to think about how they're affecting other people's lives. And that's what you want. You want people who are doing thoughtful work and really considering the effect that they're having on people. There are many, many, many sources of technology ethics out there that you can reference and use as a basis. You want to think about how they fit with your values. How do they fit with the work that you're doing? What lines are you most concerned with crossing that your team, you really want to make sure that they stay in one particular area and don't venture into another area? And how do you want to track your progress? So there are many organizations, such as the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, that have technology ethics. Large corporations are developing their own technology ethics. Ethical OS and the AI Now Institute are some other organizations. Montreal Declaration for Responsible AI is the one I'll talk about today. And then the U.S. Department of Defense actually does also have AI technical ethics. And you may be surprised by that, but it's actually been something they've been working on for many years through all of their work. And the Defense Innovation Board had recommended that they look at 5 specific ethical ideas, and then those were adopted just last month. So one of the things that is really important here, I think, is that AI does not remove the responsibility from people. What is new about AI does not change human responsibility. And that's a quote from the Defense Innovation Advisory Board member, Michael McQuaid. And I think it's a really powerful statement, that we're not removing our responsibilities. And in fact, humans are still responsible for everything that we do, and that we need to maintain that versus giving responsibility to an AI system. It's just a computer. We shouldn't be giving that kind of responsibility to those systems, particularly for really important decisions. So today I'm talking about giving you the information you need to do this work better, because when you know better, you do better. Betty Easterly had said that many years ago, and I want you to be aware and informed as much as possible. So bias. The data that you use, the design that you create, the solutions that you end up with, they're all going to be biased. And that is because we inherently are biased the way we come into the world. We have different social classes, we have different resource availability, education, race, gender, sexuality, your culture, your theology, your traditions. This all affects your mindset. This all affects your biases as far as how you approach the world. And this is okay. This is actually normal. Bias is simply our mental shortcut. It's the way that we look at the world. It's not inherently bad, but sometimes we misapply it. And it's invisible. It's just our intuition. We have a feeling about something. We think something about someone based on how they look or what they do. And it may not be in sync with our conscious beliefs. In fact, you may find yourself thinking something and then realize you're thinking it and try to stop yourself. And that's the best part about bias. It can be managed and changed. You can adjust based on the situation, and you can adjust and work through those biases to do better. And that's what we want people to do. And we start by building awareness and knowing ourselves, really understanding what our biases are, but also thinking about how it's affecting our work and what the work that we're doing, how we can do that work better. So some qualities that help us to do this better are about the team. And part of that is that bringing together of diverse people. By bringing people together from different backgrounds, be it gender, race, or culture, which are all important aspects, but also education, school program. This doesn't mean that we're reducing the quality of applicants, but rather we're broadening that quality. We're bringing in more qualities. Disability status, thinking process, all these different aspects help us to think better. And there have been quite a few studies about this I'll talk about in a minute. But the skill set and problem framing approach can be really important, even within a set of data scientists or machine learning experts. There are lots of different roles that you may have on your team, and thinking about how to bring people together from different areas is really important. If you think about it, if all of your machine learning experts that went to the same school, they had the same education, they all took the same class from the same professors, they're most likely to approach problems in the same way, and that potentially can create some really serious problems when it comes to thinking creatively and also avoiding problems. They may all make the same mistakes and make them repeatedly because they're all thinking in the same way. So again, we're not lowering the bar, we're just extending it. We're bringing in other ideas, other individuals who can think differently. Along with that, we want to bring in curiosity experts, and this is a term I use to talk about people like myself who do user experience work, human-machine interaction, all kinds of cognitive psychologists, people who are thinking about problems of people. So thinking about the situation, the abilities of people who will use the system, how systems will be used, and trying to activate curiosity in other people using user experience activities, human-computer interaction activities. These individuals are the ones that are going to help to build the ability of the rest of the team to be curious and to do this work themselves. They may be working across multiple teams, but they're there to empower everyone to be thinking about these things. And I include social scientists, ethicists. There's so many other roles that aren't always necessarily part of an AI team that should be, because they're the ones that are going to help the team to do the best, most trustworthy work they can. And why am I talking about diverse teams? I mentioned earlier that there are studies. Harvard Business Review has done a series of articles about this, and they have looked at a lot of different research. And basically, the idea is that a diverse team is much more likely to focus on facts. And this is because as individuals themselves, they are all more aware of their own potential biases and more aware of the differences amongst the individuals. And so they're going to think through facts more carefully because they're coming with their own bias and they're aware of the bias that is around them. They're going to be able to think a little bit more clearly and be more innovative. And it's not to say that any one of these individuals on their own necessarily is more innovative or more creative, but together they actually bring those strengths together and they build a much more creative team, a stronger team. And there's also been studies that have shown that companies who value these things, diversity and inclusion, are more likely to make more revenue as well, which is really exciting. So great minds think different. You want a team that is really thinking differently and able to get outside of the common comfort zone and think about things in a little bit differently. This does require that representatively diverse leadership is available, and this is because of retention. Without that leadership there, without people who look different in that higher level, it's really hard for individuals to see a path. It's hard for people to see how they are part of the organization, to see someone who understands their point of view, who understands the challenges that they're facing. So that's a really important step. And I highly encourage teams to consider whether they have in place the individuals who are going to be able to be in those positions, and if not, to do the work to put those people in place. Because without that leadership, retention is not going to be a positive situation. People are going to leave rather quickly because they won't feel they belong. And ideally, in an inclusive situation, people are able to bring their whole selves to work. So we are all, I imagine most of you anyway, are working from home at this point or working from another place where you are by yourself. And in that situation, we're going to see lots of dogs and cats and other parts of humans, parts of our real lives. And that's really important. This is about us being able to bring ourselves to work and be in a welcoming environment, to feel connected and valued and that we belong. And by learning more about each other and being more diverse to begin with, we're more likely to have that situation. So, I mentioned the Montreal Declaration of Responsible AI. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they have 10 very broad areas within technology. So it is about technology, but as you can see, this list is pretty broad. And the reason why I recommend starting with this list is because it's most likely to fulfill the needs of your project. If you have a tech project and you look at it against these 10 ideas, you're most likely to find something that's going to cover all the areas you need covered. And by starting with an existing set of technology ethics, you don't have to do the work of developing one yourself. You can use the work that they have done for you. So by building a diverse and inclusive team with those diverse, inclusive leaders, you're going to be able to then have those multidisciplinary teams work with those shared tech ethics and really create wonderful things. So bringing all these individuals together, this is a step that's necessary to be able to then get to the next step, which is to take a framework such as the one I'm proposing, the UX framework, and apply it to the work that you're doing. But how do we get there? So we've got these ethics. We need to do some work in the middle, and that's what I'm going to be talking about now, is how we get to a trustable, ethical AI system with those teams, with that set of ethics. So there are a lot of difficult topics with this work, and it requires conversations to be able to actually determine how to deal with situations. This is the hardest part. When I was mentioning the curiosity experts earlier, those are the individuals that can help through these questions. So thinking about what do we value, who could be hurt by the system, what lines won't our AI cross, how are we shifting power, how are individuals gaining or losing power with the system, and then how are we going to track our progress. And so by bringing together this team with different skills, a multidisciplinary team that's also diverse themselves, we're more likely to be creative in thinking about these types of ideas and thinking about individuals who have less access, individuals who are typically biased against those types of things. And these individuals can help, the curiosity experts can help those teams to have those conversations in a constructive manner. And these are uncomfortable. Laura Kalbeck says, be uncomfortable. Ethical design is not superficial. These are not light conversations. This is not easy work. This is work that requires you to really think and move forward in a much more social way than you might be used to. I was presenting at a conference recently, and one of the audience members asked me, well, what about the developers who don't do this work? And that my response was they need to learn to do this work. It's no longer typing on a keyboard away from everyone else. You really have to get in deeper and have these conversations now. The work is too important, and the people that we're affecting are, potentially losing homes, losing their lives, losing their freedom because of the decisions we're making with the applications that we're developing. So we really need to have these conversations. So the framework itself is four basic areas: accountable to humans, cognizant of speculative risks and benefits, respectful and secure, and honest and usable. And I'll get into each of these in a moment. But these four aspects bring us together into making ethical AI by looking at each of these aspects individually. So accountable to humans. We ensure humans have ultimate control and they're able to monitor and control risk. Now, this doesn't mean that humans necessarily need to approve every single decision that the AI is making. So, for example, with a autonomous vehicle, we would want the system to understand how to brake. We would want the system to understand how to speed up or potentially even change lanes without getting approval necessarily. There are different situations that require different types of approval, and we want to think through each of those aspects. But the human should be able to, for example, stop the vehicle if needed. The human should be able to turn it off at all times. And so when you think about this, it's particularly important for final decisions regarding a person's life, their quality of life, their health, and their reputation. Those are situations where you really want to make sure that the system is being overseen by a human and that those decisions have clear guidance from a human and that they can be appealed if they're decided in a way that humans would disagree. Grady Booch has this great quote in his TED Talk from a few years ago: "Ensure humans can unplug the machines." And he talks a lot about this. We need to reduce the fear and just make sure that there's always a backdoor. There's a way that we can make the systems work better. We don't need 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's bad design. We need to make these systems usable and useful and answerable to humans so that we can continue to be in control. And when I talk about cognitive of speculative risks and benefits, this is where that creativity comes in. This is our work to identify the full range of harmful, malicious use, as well as good, beneficial use. So when you think about harmful and malicious use particularly, this is where a diverse team can be of great service to an organization. So if you think about home cameras and home heating and cooling systems, we've heard more in the news about individuals who have ex-partners or individuals who are basically hurting them by manipulating the system in their home. And these are the types of things that if you had someone on the team who had been a victim of those types of crimes or could imagine being a victim of those types of crimes, you're more likely to think of ways to prevent that because someone on the team has had that experience. If it's a team of people who have always been in situations where they felt safe and they've never felt that vulnerability, they're less likely to be creative in that way. And so again, the harmful, malicious use area is really where that diverse team comes in the most, it could be the most help. And blind spots and unwanted and unintended consequences, they're just things that we don't see, that we don't understand if we all come from the same point of view. And so having a diverse group of people thinking about this from their points of view, from their life experiences, we're much more likely to really make a smart system, a system that is thought about all those negative potential consequences, but also the positive ones. They can also think of beneficial uses that we may not think of. And speculative activities, so activities that actually activate your curiosity, are a really important part of this. So one activity is to do work to consider the abuse and misuse through creating a Black Mirror episode. If you're familiar, there's a TV show, and you can Google it later, called Black Mirror, and I highly recommend watching. The episodes are usually based on misuse and abuse of technology to the extreme. And they're very entertaining and very disturbing. But the idea being that you're looking really carefully at the severe abuse and consequences from your system. What's the worst possible thing that could happen? Don't need to be exhaustive about every possible thing, but if you've at least taken the time to think about the severe abuse and consequences and thought about what could happen with the data that you're providing or the data that you're receiving, thought about how it's going to potentially be accessed, when you're doing that work to think through those consequences, you're also more able to then mitigate and think about what should we be preventing, what should we be prepared for in the event that it occurs. So by planning for those consequences, you can think about who can report this and who they report it to. How would we turn the system off? Who turns the system off? Who's notified? And what are the consequences of turning the system off? If we turn the system off, who now needs a backup system? And what is that backup system? And how do we deal with that situation? So by thinking this through ahead of time, you are ready if something should happen to communicate, to shut the system off, to do the right thing. And this is typical work that we should be doing in any situation, but I find that people do it less with AI systems than they should, and that's what I'm talking about. The respectful and secure piece is really about valuing the things that your organization should value. So humanity, ethics, equity, fairness, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion, and thinking about how does this work with relation to the system we're making. How are we going to protect and respect privacy and data rights? What are we going to limit the collection of, for example? So do we need to collect social security numbers in the United States? Maybe, maybe not. And if we don't, that further protects the individuals that we're making the system for or giving the system access to. How are we going to make the system robust and valid and reliable? How are we going to make sure that the system is available when it's needed, that people can trust the information in it? And how are we going to manage security in a way that it can be understandable to people so that they don't have to write down the password or keep something somewhere else, that they are able to access the system easily and then use the system as it's intended. And part of this is making sure that we remove the unwanted bias in data. And as I mentioned before, all data is biased. And an example would be if you're building a lawn care system, some lawn care systems might be, AI systems may be more relatable to an organization that believes in using a lot of chemicals, whereas another system may be better for an organization that uses less chemicals. And so those are both biased in different ways. And you want to think through what is the desirable bias in the system, what is the known bias, and how can we communicate about that, and what issues do we have, what issues are in the data that we don't like or that we want to make sure that people are aware of, and then just communicate about that with the users so that they're aware of the system and its limitations. And then honest and usable has a lot to do with the honesty I was just talking about in communication, but also in just providing transparency. And the goal here is engendering trust. So it doesn't have to be full transparency as far as showing the algorithms if the audience isn't going to be able to understand them, but rather helping them to understand where is this data from, when was it last updated, what is the primary source, what is the bias there, being open and honest with people about that. And then explicitly stating the identity as an AI system. And this is tricky. If you think about chat systems, sometimes you may be unsure if it's an AI system or not. And so if you ask, is this a human, there should be a response that confirms if it's an AI or not, and helps people understand it. And the same with any other AI system. It should be pretty clear when humans are dealing with other humans versus AI systems so that they have the right expectations and so that they're not surprised with what they're dealing with. So these are the four, and basically this is about being intentional and keeping people safe. So accountability to humans, being cognizant of the speculative risks and benefits of the system, making sure the system is respectful and secure, and then being honest and usable in the way that we create the system as well. So I'm going to go into the checklist and agreement briefly. And this is online. There's a QR code there that you can scan potentially, or this presentation will obviously be online, and we can link to the checklist as well. But the idea is that with this checklist, you can begin to make sure you're having those conversations. And the idea is that you pair it with the technical ethics. So if you're using the Montreal Declaration for Responsible AI, you would use that paired with this checklist to bridge the gap between any statements that are more nebulous, that are unclear, that are vague. So, for example, if you have a set of technical ethics that say do no harm, how are you actually going to implement that? How is that actually become part of your system in a way that makes sense. And so this encourages those conversations. It'll help you reduce risk and unwanted bias, improve your mitigation planning so that you're ready for those potential consequences, and support the inspection of the entire system. And there are examples in there such as we will work speculatively to identify the full range of risks and benefits. And so, just helping to make sure that you've done those things. And also, again, encouraging you to look back at your set of technical ethics to see how it's described in those ethics as well. Another idea for supporting your team is to reward them for finding ethical bugs in the system. So Dr. Ayanna Howard, she recently spoke on a podcast called Artificial Intelligence with Lex Friedman, and she talked about how we can use this as an incentive. So much like we would reward people for finding other types of bugs, we should reward them for finding ethics bugs. And that way the team can be more invested and have fun with doing this work and really see the benefit as well, ideally. And I highly recommend that podcast as well. So evangelize for human values, be ethical, transparent, and fair in your work. And remember that we aren't perfect. The AI will not be perfect. And that this work is not meant to significantly slow down the effort of creating an AI, but rather to make sure that we're doing as good as we can, given what we know, and making sure that the first thing that we release is at least not causing harm to individuals. And then we'll continue to improve on these systems as we go, as this work will continue to improve as well. So diverse teams and inclusive environments, adopting the set of technical ethics that will help them to bridge the gap between themselves, encouraging those deep conversations by using a checklist, helping people to activate curiosity, to be speculative and imaginative, and in the end, making those systems as trustworthy as possible. So I encourage you to apply what I've talked about today and think about how you can identify an initial set of technology ethics and ideally introduce that to a team this week or next week and provide them with a checklist and do this as an experiment. See how it changes the way that they're working, see what they think about it. If those tech ethics don't fit, that's fine. This is all for an experiment. And then in the next 3 months, you can work towards adopting a set of technology ethics that works better for you. And then begin to run those abusability workshops. I talked about the Black Mirror session. That's an abusability workshop. Start trying to integrate those types of activities into your work and expand the use of the checklist to more teams. And then over the next 6 months, you can begin to measure progress. So are you seeing more proactiveness? Are you seeing more quality conversations versus surprises from the individuals on your teams? You ideally want less surprises and those better conversations early on so that you know that you're building the right things. And feel free to reach out to me. And Shane, do we have any questions? Here's my contact information if you need it while he's checking to see if we have any. Shane,
Hi, Carol. We do have
Okay.
a couple questions. So one from Steve asking earlier, has it become possible for AI or neural networks to describe how they reached a decision?
Oh, yeah. So that does take work. It does take effort to...
We do have a couple questions. So
Okay, I'm hearing that in the background, but yeah. So doing the work to get these systems to explain themselves is not easy. I'm not suggesting that there are easy ways to do this, but it is possible. With neural networks, it sometimes takes a lot more work because they're much more complex systems. And with machine learning, it is definitely possible. But again, it does take a lot of work to be able to do that. It is possible and it is necessary for the people who are using these systems to really understand how they work and to make sure that those systems are understood. They should not be black boxes. That's really not an appropriate use of technology, particularly for things that affect humans. We would need to really understand what they're doing and why, or a human needs to be in the loop to make those decisions.
Next, we had a follow-up, another one from Steve asking, does it make sense for AI to transfer control to a human expert without when confusion arises? And aside to that might be the creation of a reward system for AI. as it gets closer to the desired goals?
Yeah. I personally don't have experience with the word systems, but I have heard of good success with them. But I would definitely recommend the human be in the loop, the human making those decisions until the AI system is responsible. And even then, the human should always be observing systems, particularly those making really important decisions with regard to humans' life or their well-being, those types of things. The human should always be observing them and keeping track. It shouldn't be a situation where an AI is just left to do its thing without any observation at all. We're responsible for the decisions that they're making, and we should make sure that we're aware of what is going on with the systems.
Okay, then we had a comment question from Demi asking, I forget what section this was in, but it says, are the experts, but are there experts? Are they being more curious than a normal researcher?
So with the curiosity experts, I would not say they're being more curious than the normal user experience researcher. Researcher is kind of a broad term. I do think that people who are focused on the technology aspect, so if you're talking about like a machine learning expert researcher, I do think that they are much more concerned, as they should be, with the technical problems than they are necessarily with the human problems. And so the curiosity experts would be much more focused on being curious about the human aspect of the system and thinking through the implications in that sense. So it's a different way of looking at the problem. A common setup that I've seen is to have the technology experts and people, if it's a product, like a product expert people, and then people who are doing that curiosity work, the user experience specialists. There are lots of different names for these individuals, but people who are representing the users, the people who actually use the product, the people who will be affected by the product.
Okay. Next we had, do you have any tips on how to attract a diverse team given the inherent skew in the population of talented, skilled people?
Yeah. So it's definitely a big challenge. I'm not suggesting that that's simple either, but it is really important. So there are lots of great organizations out there, such as there's a Black Engineers Association that would be potentially a good recruiting solution. There is a Grace Hopper conference, which probably won't happen in person this year. We'll see. But that's another excellent place to find primarily women and women of color as well. So there are specific organizations, and you just want to make sure that you're reaching out to those organizations and making sure that you are interviewing a lot of people. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that when you are recruiting, if the population that you're looking at, if the candidates aren't diverse themselves, you're less likely to pick a candidate that is from a diverse background. So you do want to broaden your view so that you are getting the right selection of candidates, so that when you interview and when you're doing the work, that you are more likely to pick the best candidate, but also one that is more diverse than your typical range. I would also encourage people to look at a broader set of universities. A lot of large companies tend to pick from a few select universities. Not that those people aren't awesome, but we do want to make sure that you're getting a more diverse set, and so just broadening a little bit so that you can get a better group of individuals together is important.
Terrific. Matthew asked, do you have any more examples of concrete user experience interactions where you were consulting to build an AI system and some of the outcomes from those experiences, if you can speak to that or we're allowed to?
Yeah. I can't, unfortunately, speak to specific instances,
Right.
But yeah. Sorry.
Gotcha. How about, can we share the link to the technical report or research paper that talks about the framework?
Oh, yeah. So there's on the HCII website, as well as on Archive, you can find a paper that I wrote about this, and it's linked here as well. So on the HCII site, and we can post some links in the chat as well. But the paper is there, and the checklist as well for your reference. And I'm
okay. And the last one I see in,
okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
The last one I see in the queue then is so if you have other questions, folks, feel free to type them in now, but this will be the potentially last one. What role does declarative modeling have in your work?
So I don't do that work myself. I don't work in, I'm not a machine learning expert, and I don't work in that myself, so I probably shouldn't even try to answer that. Okay. But if you have this more specific question, I can try, but.
Great. So I think that's all the questions we have. We'll wait another minute or two. So today's event was archived, so it'll be available here at this URL once we shut the stream off, which we'll do another couple seconds if we don't see any more questions coming through. But again, we thank you for everyone's taking the time today. We're going to try to do some more webcasts here over the next couple of weeks while a lot of us are remote to share some of our content. We thank you for sitting with us today. Carol, we thank you for an excellent presentation and taking the time on the short notice to get this out and take time today. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Okay. Folks, that's going to wrap up our presentation today. We'll look for future invites to our webcast, and the archive of this will be available shortly. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.